In 1955, a single dollar in Canada could buy you 10 loaves of bread. Not one loaf. 10. That same dollar could fill your gas tank twice. It could buy you 20 chocolate bars. It could cover a family dinner at a restaurant with change left over. Today, that dollar buys you absolutely nothing. You can't even get a candy bar. The purchasing power has collapsed so completely that 1955 prices sound like they're from a different planet. Here's what everyday items actually cost in 1955 Canada, and why comparing them to today reveals an economic catastrophe that nobody wants to talk about. A gallon of gas, 39 cents. Regular gasoline costs 39 cents per gallon. That's about 10 cents per liter in Canadian measurements. With a dollar, you could buy 2.5 gallons, enough to drive approximately 40–50 miles depending on your car. Gas in Canada averages $1.60 per liter, $6.06 per gallon as of 2024. That's a 1,454% increase. But here's where it gets worse. The average Canadian minimum wage in 1955 was 75 cents per hour. You worked 31 minutes to buy a gallon of gas. Today's federal minimum wage is $17.30 per hour. You work 21 minutes to buy a gallon. So actually, in terms of labor hours, gas got slightly cheaper, but only if you ignore that a 1955 worker could afford a house, a car, and support a family on that 75 cents per hour, while you definitely cannot on $17.30. But here's what this really means. In 1955, you could drive to work for a week on less than $2 in gas. Today, that same commute costs $40.60 per week. The dollar amount is meaningless. What matters is that gas went from being an afterthought expense to a significant budget item that people stress about. A loaf of bread, 10 cents. A standard loaf of white bread costs 10 cents. With a dollar, you bought 10 loaves. A family of 4 eating 2 loaves per week spent 20 cents on bread. That's 80 cents per month for a staple food. A loaf of bread costs $3.50, 4.00 in Canadian grocery stores. That's a 3,500 to 4,000% increase. Your dollar now buys you 1/4 of a loaf. That family of 4 now spends $28.32 per month on bread, 40 times more than 1955. The 1955 worker, making $0.75 worked 8 minutes to buy a loaf of bread. Today's worker at $17.30 works 12 miters 14 minutes. Bread actually got more expensive relative to wages, which is insane because bread is one of the cheapest foods to mass produce. Flour, water, yeast, salt. Industrial bread production should have become vastly more efficient over 70 years. It did, but the price still increased 35–40 times. But here's the real shock. In 1955, groceries were such a small portion of your budget that families didn't stress about food costs. Today, food insecurity affects 15% of Canadian households, despite vastly higher nominal wages. The dollar collapsed, while food prices exploded. A movie ticket, 50 cents going to the movies, cost 50 cents for adults, 25 cents for children. A family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, saw a movie for $1.50. Entertainment was accessible and affordable. Movies were packed because working-class families could afford weekly trips to the theater. Movie tickets cost $14.18 in Canadian cities. That family of 4 now pays $50.65 for the same experience. That's a 3,300% increase. Even accounting for better sound systems and comfortable seats, you're paying 33 times more for 2 hours of entertainment. The 1955 worker earned $0.75 and paid 50 cents for a movie, 40 minutes of work. Today's worker at $17.30 an hour pays $16 for a movie, 55 minutes of work. Movies got more expensive relative to wages, and this is before you factor in that 1955 tickets included newsreels and cartoons before the feature. You got more content for less money. But here's what changed. In 1955, entertainment was designed to be accessible to everyone. Studios made money through volume, packed theaters with affordable tickets. Entertainment is premium priced. Studios make money through price discrimination, charge whatever people will pay because streaming gave alternatives. The culture shifted from everyone can afford this to entertainment is a luxury. A new car, $2,400. A brand new 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air, a mid-range family sedan, cost $2,400. The average Canadian income was approximately $3,500 per year. You could buy a new car for 8.5 months of average income. The average new car in Canada costs $50,000, $60,000. The average Canadian income is $55,000 per year. You're spending 13 months of income on a car, more than a full year. And that's median income if you're making minimum wage $36,000. A new car costs 1.6 years of gross income. But here's where the comparison breaks down. The 1955 Bel Air had no air conditioning, no power steering, no seat belts, drum brakes, and got 15 mpg. Today's cars have airbags, ABS, backup cameras, Bluetooth, and get 35 mpg. You're paying for vastly superior technology. But you're also paying proportionally more of your income than your grandparents did, and they could actually afford it without taking 7-year loans at 8% interest. The real shock. In 1955, a working-class family could save for 3 years and buy a car cash. Today, 84% of new car purchases are financed because nobody can afford to save $55,000. The debt became necessary because the price increased faster than wages. A house, $13,500. The average Canadian house costs $13,500. $13,500. A modest 3-bedroom house in a Toronto suburb cost what you'd pay today for a used car. The average Canadian income was $3,500, meaning a house cost 3.9 times annual income. The average Canadian house costs $720,000 as of 2024. Toronto area houses average $1.1 million. The average income is $55,000. The house now costs 13 tours, 20 times annual income. You're paying 5 times more relative to earnings than your grandparents did. The 1955 buyer saved for 4 years for a down payment and got a 20-year mortgage at 5% interest. The house was paid off by age 45 v50. Today's buyer saves for 15 years for a down payment if they can at all. Gets a 30-year mortgage at 6 to 7% interest and will be paying until age 65-70. The math is so broken that homeownership went from expected to impossible for most millennials and Gen Z. But here's the catastrophic part. In 1955, a single income, the father working while the mother raised children, could afford a house, car, food, and entertainment. Today, 2 incomes can barely afford rent and groceries. The economic accessibility collapsed entirely. The dollar didn't just lose value. The entire structure of middle-class life became unaffordable. A dozen eggs, 59 cents. A dozen eggs cost 59 cents. You worked 47 minutes. At minimum wage, $0. 75 hours to buy a dozen eggs. Eggs were a cheap protein source accessible to everyone. A dozen eggs costs $4.50, 5.00 in Canadian stores. 2024 prices after recent inflation spikes. You work 16 minutes at minimum wage, $17.30 hour to buy eggs. So eggs actually got cheaper relative to labor hours. You're working less time to afford them. But here's the twist. Eggs are one of the few items that got relatively more affordable. Why? Because industrial chicken farming became so efficient that production costs collapsed. A 1955 egg farm needed 20 workers to manage 10,000 chickens. Today's operation needs 3 workers managing 100,000 chickens using automated systems. Efficiency improved faster than inflation increased. This proves something important: when productivity gains are passed to consumers instead of captured by corporations, prices can stay stable or even decrease relative to wages. Eggs got cheaper. Houses didn't. The difference isn't inflation, it's where the profits go. A pound of coffee, 79 cents. A pound of ground coffee costs 79 cents. You worked 63 minutes at minimum wage to buy coffee for the week. Coffee was a daily staple that working-class families could afford. A pound of coffee costs $12.15 in Canadian stores. You work 42 meters in at 52 minutes at minimum wage. Coffee actually got slightly more expensive relative to labor, but not catastrophically. The 1,400% price increase is mostly explained by inflation rather than fundamental affordability collapse. But here's what changed. In 1955, you made coffee at home because it was cheap. Today, millions of Canadians spend $5 daily on coffee shop drinks, $150 per month, $1,800 per year. That's not inflation. That's a cultural shift where convenience replaced frugality. The working-class person in 1955 would see spending $5 on coffee as insane. Today it's normal because time scarcity, working longer hours to afford less, makes convenience valuable. A gallon of milk, 52 cents. A gallon of milk cost 52 cents. That's 42 minutes of minimum wage work. Milk was a staple that every family could afford daily. 10 gallons of milk, 4 liters in Canada, cost $1.67. That's 24 minutes of minimum wage work. Milk got dramatically cheaper relative to labor hours. You're working half the time to afford it compared to 1955. The reason: industrial dairy farming, refrigerated supply chains, and government subsidies made milk production incredibly efficient. A 1955 dairy farm milked 20 to 30 cows by hand twice daily. Today's dairy operation milks 200 to 300 cows using automated systems. Production cost per gallon dropped by 70%, even as volume increased massively. But here's the irony. Milk got more affordable while housing became impossible. Both experienced technological improvements. Modular housing and prefab construction should have made homes cheaper to build. But housing prices are determined by land scarcity and financialization, not production costs. Milk responds to efficiency gains. Housing doesn't. A university year, $400–500. A full year of university tuition at University of Toronto cost approximately $400–500. Books and fees were another $100. Total cost $600 for an entire year of higher education. That's 800 hours of minimum wage work, about 20 weeks of full-time employment. University of Toronto charges $6,400 for in-province tuition plus $1,000. Total $8,000 per year. That's 462 hours of minimum wage work at $17, 30 hour, 12 weeks of full-time employment. Wait, university got cheaper? Relative to minimum wage labor hours? Yes. But here's the catastrophic catch. In 1955, you could work full-time in summer 16 weeks at $0, 75 hour = $480, and earn almost enough to pay for the full year. Today, you work full-time in summer 16 weeks at $17, 30 hour = $4,422 after tax, and that doesn't cover tuition, let alone rent, food, and books. The difference: in 1955, university students lived at home with parents who had affordable housing. Today, university means paying $1,200, $1,500 406, $400, $18,000 per year, because your parents' house is 90 minutes away and they can't afford to support you. The tuition calculation misses that living costs exploded while tuition stayed relatively stable. A restaurant meal, $1.50 for full dinner, a complete restaurant dinner, soup, bonneterie, dessert, coffee, cost $1.50 at a standard diner. That's 2 hours of minimum wage work. Families could afford to eat out weekly. The equivalent meal, mid-range casual restaurant, costs $25.30. That's 104 minutes of minimum wage work. Restaurant meals got slightly more expensive relative to labor, 2 hours versus 1.55 or 1.7 hours, but not dramatically. But here's what the numbers miss. In 1955, restaurant meals were common for working-class families because other expenses, housing, transportation, food were so cheap that discretionary spending was possible. Today, restaurant meals are budget luxuries. The cost relative to wages is similar, but the affordability disappeared because every other expense exploded. What happened? Why the dollar collapsed? The raw numbers are shocking, but they miss the real story. It's not just that prices increased 1,000 to 4,000%. It's that the relationship between wages and life costs broke completely. The dollar increased 23x nominally, but purchasing power for the things that matter, housing, security, stability, collapsed. You're earning more dollars that buy vastly less life quality. Why did some items got cheaper and others got impossible? Technology-driven goods got more affordable. Eggs, milk, and manufactured goods benefited from automation and efficiency. When productivity increases are passed to consumers, prices stabilize or drop relative to wages. Scarcity-driven goods got impossible. Housing and education are constrained by land scarcity and artificial limitations. No amount of efficiency makes more land in Toronto. When goods are scarce and financialized, prices become untethered from production costs. The brutal truth, the economy split into two categories. Things that can be mass-produced efficiently got cheaper. Things that are inherently scarce got impossibly expensive. Your grandparents bought life stability, house, education, security, cheaply. You buy consumer goods, food, electronics, clothes cheaply but can't afford stability at any price. That's the real story behind 1955 prices. The dollar didn't just inflate. The entire economic structure changed from everyone can afford a stable life to most people can afford stuff but not security. The prices that shock you aren't about dollars. They're about the collapse of middle-class stability that once seemed like a birthright and now seems like a fantasy. The numbers aren't just shocking. They're evidence of an economic transformation that destroyed the life pattern your grandparents took for granted, and nobody wants to admit it's never coming back.